My name's Maurice Blik, and I've been making sculpture on a professional basis for 30 odd years. And it's only in the last 2 or 3 years that I took the plunge to try and explain some of the sources of my work, because up until now, or then, I've been very reluctant to talk about, because some of the sources go back to a rather painful childhood. And the book, Art of Survival, looks at that relationship, and for the first time really in my life, I suppose, I have taken ownership of the narrative, and the book is an explanation of that. I'm going to read a couple of chapters which really illustrate that sort of relationship, and hope it helps people understand where it all comes from. 1976, horse sculpture. I was sat in the kitchen of our comfortable 5-bedroom Edwardian property in Muswell Hill, a leafy, affluent area of North London. This was home for me, my wife, and our 2 children. I had converted the large semi-basement into a pottery studio for my wife. There were 2 huge kilns and steps out to the garden at the back. She had a decent business making studio pottery, domestic wares and planters. This particular day, one of her customers had come to discuss a new project. He was a businessman with a company making horse riding equipment. He also had a craft outlet, which was where he sold her pottery. He explained that he wanted to promote his equestrian business by presenting an award to the Young Rider of the Year. Not a conventional shield or cup, he wanted a sculpture of a horse's head. My wife began to sketch some ideas as they talked. I took my coffee and went downstairs to her pottery, where I picked up some clay. Over the next 20 minutes or so, I instinctively modelled half a dozen small horse heads about 6 inches high. It was the first time I'd touched clay in 15 years. I took them back upstairs, where they were still discussing designs, and proffered my clay heads in the hope that they might be of some help. They both looked incredulous, and he asked me where they'd come from. I told him I just made them downstairs to help clarify their ideas. He mulled this over for a moment, examining the heads. A brief silence ensued, and then he suggested perhaps I should make the trophy. I was taken aback. After teaching for so many years, I no longer saw myself as an artist, but he persuaded me to embark on the commission. I produced a terracotta horse's head about 30 inches high. The horse head was sitting in the pottery waiting to be fired when a buyer from Heels, an upmarket London store which sold my wife's pottery, came on a buying visit. She liked my sculpture, and by the time she left, we had agreed I would make some similar pieces for the Heels Art Gallery. The Lost Train. The Germans were losing the war. Days ahead of the British Army liberating Bergen-Belsen in 1945, we were herded into one of 3 trains. Ours was the notorious Lost Train. It consisted mainly of goods wagons, but also a few 3rd-class passenger carriages which had slotted wooden seats. We were fortunate to be in one of those. The train idled through the countryside for days, heading for a destination unknown. We only knew that we were away from the horrors of Belsen, and I had to believe that we were heading somewhere better. People died all the time. Their bodies would be dragged to a small external platform at the end of our carriage until they could be disposed of. The door to the balcony could barely be pushed open at times as the dead piled up. When the train stopped for a suitable interval, Prisoners were given picks and shovels to bury those who had perished, leaving a trail of shallow graves in our wake. These random stops would sometimes last for hours, usually because the tracks had been damaged by Allied bombs and alternative routes had to be found. Once, as we waited in a railway yard, I noticed piles of beetroot piled up. Taking care to avoid the armed guards on the platform, I crept off the train and grabbed some. A diet of raw beetroot is not great, but it was something to supplement our meagre rations of bread. To this day, I cannot abide eating the stuff or any purple root vegetables which remind me of it. On more than one occasion, our train was shot at by aircraft. When that happened, the guard would yell, "Raus!" and "Ausstehen," get up, and everybody would flee the train and flatten themselves in the fields. Mother would throw herself on top of Clara and me. I remember a bullet passing so close to my ear that I could feel the heat. I dug it out of the ground and kept it for years. I've been asked by people why we didn't make a run for it when the train stopped. Maybe some people did, but I doubt it. There were armed guards who in all likelihood would have shot anyone trying to escape. We were in a desperate physical condition, weak and dressed in rags. Which direction, if any, represented safety? How could my mother begin to contemplate escaping into the open countryside in this state, and with 2 young children? Added to which, starvation and the level of dehumanizing treatment we had endured tends to make people compliant. Better the devil you know. 1945, Trobic. I woke to loud commotion, people shouting and cheering and everybody waving and hugging each other. I climbed up onto a seat and looked out of the little window. Men in unfamiliar uniforms, armed to the teeth, were riding on horseback, whooping and shouting and waving their rifles in the air. Cossacks. There was a tremendous energy and noise, and everybody was over the moon to see them. We scrambled off the train, and they escorted us to the nearby village of Trobic. The majority of the German residents had fled, but I recall one villager shouting, "Wir haben diesen Kreis verloren, aber wir werden Nachten gewinnen." We lost this war, but we'll win the next. I had a basic grasp of German picked up from the guards in Belsen. When your captors speak a different language, you make it your business to know what they're saying. We arrived at a large house and were told to go inside. Mother, Clara and I would stay here. Clara and I went upstairs where a large, beautiful bed, sheets, pillows and a big fat eiderdown greeted us. After 18 months of sleeping, the 3 of us in one bunk balanced on 2 wooden planks, and days of catching what sleep we could on the floor of the train, Clara and I climbed into the bed and slept. A gruff, loud voice was shouting something in a language that I didn't understand. Standing next to our bed was a soldier, Russian, like the ones who had taken us off the train. He was waving, shouting angrily and pointing at Clara. Clara with her blue eyes and mass of curly blonde hair, unlike me with my dark hair and brown eyes. He was gesticulating, getting more and more agitating, waving her away with his hand. I understood that he wanted her out, but why? I put my arms round her and said, "My sister, she's my sister," in Dutch, of course. He didn't understand. His gestures and words became more insistent. "Out, get her out." I held on to her even more tightly. my sister, I pleaded. He took the rifle off his shoulder and pointed it at Clara and held it ready to shoot. He was looking straight at her. He thinks she's German. I kept a tight hold on her. No, 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 she's my sister, I kept repeating. His eyes softened. Perhaps he realized I was not speaking German. Maybe she wasn't a German girl. Maybe some Jews were blonde, not dark-haired and dark-eyed. He put his rifle back in his shoulder and left. I had looked after her. I looked after my sister, as I promised Father I would. We stayed with the Cossacks for about 3 months. They organized bread baking and drove around the village in their troikas, standing on the back of the middle of 3 horses, showing off their superb horsemanship. They were rowdy and full of life, which I found exciting and intoxicating. Their displays of masculine bravado and strength left an indelible mark on me, as did the wristwatches which they wore up their arms, trophies, I believe, from the Germans they had killed. In spite of their fierce reputation, these Russian soldiers only ever showed us kindness and generosity. The kitchen in our house was well stocked with jars of preserves, but every day the adults would go out to forage for extra food, returning with sacks of vegetables from the nearby farms, and sometimes even chickens and pigs. The pigs screamed horribly when they were slaughtered. The kosher diet was an ideal we could no longer afford. I was proud of my beautifully round, distended stomach in the early weeks. It soon disappeared, and by the time we left Trowbridge for England, Clara and I looked well fed and healthy. During one of my sessions with Jean, with whom I was having some psychotherapy, I spoke about how we'd been rescued from the train by those flamboyant Russians on horseback. Some weeks later, she asked to see some of my sculptures, and I showed her images of the horses' heads that I was exhibiting and selling. Jean considered them for a while, and then observed that it was the second time I had been rescued by horses. I was puzzled. First by the Cossacks on horseback, she explained, and now my horse sculptures were providing the key to my future, giving me a positive direction. It was as if a light had been shone on my work. I had made the sculptures with no thought of the Cossacks and their horses, or awareness of what they might symbolize. But clearly, these life-affirming creatures had ignited a dormant response in me, reconnecting me with a deep sense of survival.